Hello and welcome. I'm Peter Collopy. I'm University Archivist and Head of Special Collections here at Caltech. And I have the honor to welcome you to Caltech's PST Art Symposia Day. The day is assembled of 4 panels that are going to reflect 3 different projects that Caltech has pursued over the last up to 5 years, depending on the project. You can see here these projects are entitled Blended Worlds, Opening Doors, and Crossing Over. And what these 3 projects have in common is that they're each about art and science, and they're each part of a Southern California-wide program sponsored by the Getty Foundation entitled PST Art and Science Collide. PST Art and Science Collide is the Getty Foundation's 3rd incarnation of a program you may have heard of in the past under the name Pacific Standard Time. And it's an ongoing program that they plan to continue every 5 years to sponsor exhibitions on some common theme related to the arts at a variety of institutions. I have to share with you the schedule of our day. As I mentioned, we have 4 different panels that make up the day. And I have the opportunity now to introduce our first panel, which I will be moderating, and which is entitled Art and Science at Caltech, 4 Histories. And this panel draws from the research project behind the exhibition, Crossing Over, Art and Science at Caltech, 1920 to 2020, which is here on campus, and which will be closing after tomorrow. So I hope that those of you who haven't had the opportunity yet take some time in between sessions today to check out the exhibition. I do have a couple more notes before I get more into the panel. We are recording all 4 panels today, so if there are any you're not able to make it to, or if you have any friends or colleagues to share the information with, they will be available through Caltech's website and YouTube after the day. Today, specifically, is part of the James Michelin Distinguished Lecture Series. And so we thank the series for support and also want to suggest that you keep an eye on the James Michelin Distinguished Lecture Series, which brings distinguished speakers on topics of art and technology here to Caltech regularly. So for more along these lines in the future, this may be a place to look. The James Michelin Distinguished Lecture Series is administered by Caltech's Division of the Humanities and Social Sciences. In addition to the Getty, which has supported all 3 of the projects that are reflected today, Crossing Over has specifically received support from Pasadena Art Alliance and from individual donors. And so there's a lot of effort that has gone into producing the work in front of you. For further information about these 3 programs, you can go to pst.caltech.edu. For further information about Caltech events, you can go to events.caltech.edu. So there's more happening now and in the future. This first session is related to a book which accompanies our exhibition, the book also entitled Crossing Over, Art and Science at Caltech, 1920 to 2020. And the book consists of 12 essays on different aspects of art and science in Caltech's history, as well as a foreword, an introduction, a preface, an epilogue. There's a lot of pieces, and a really rich set of images that reflect this history. So some of the folks who contributed to the research project behind both the books and the exhibition show up on the screen now. And I will just pitch that the book is available at Caltech Library, Caltech Store, Getty Store, and wherever fine books are sold. The Caltech campus locations are not open on Saturdays, but if you're here in the future, please check them out. And so, as I mentioned, our panel draws from the research that is behind the book and the exhibition, and consists of 4 of the contributors to the book specifically, listed here. And this gives me an opportunity to introduce the first of our 4 presenters today. Soraya de Chadarevian is a historian of biology and professor in the Department of History and the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA. Among other works, Soraya is the author of Heredity Under the Microscope, Chromosomes and the Study of the Human Genome, and co-editor of Models, The Third Dimension of Science, a book closely related to the research she'll be presenting for us today. I'm going to ask Soraya to take it from here, please.
Okay, thank you. So my research for crossing over concerned the atomic or molecular world. And this is a world in the angstrom dimension. So an angstrom is 0.1 nanometer, and a nanometer is billionths of a meter. So it's very small. I think a paper here, the thickness of a paper is 100,000 nanometers. And here we are 0.1 nanometer. So very small. So it's in this dimension, so we cannot see it with our eyes, but scientists must somehow make it visible to make sense of it. And this is where scientists and artists interact. So in my work, I focused on two Caltech scientists who worked closely with artists to create the images that still represent that world for us and that you see in the exhibition. And so these are Linus Pauling, chemist here at Caltech, who directed the division of chemistry and chemical engineering here from the mid-1930s to the mid-1960s. And he collaborated closely with Roger Hayward, a local architect, artist, skilled draftsman, and much more beside. So in the exhibition, you also see him. He was also an optical inventor, an amateur astronomer, and so you see him also popping up in other parts of the exhibition, not just in the parts on the molecules. And the other pair is Richard Dickerson, Pauling's successor in many ways, who collaborated closely with Irving Geis, a New York-based architect and artist who, in contrast to Hayward, dedicated himself fully to molecular drawings. And so now I will tell you a little more about these two scientist-artist collaboration. So to start with Linus Pauling, he used X-ray crystallography to determine the structure of molecules. So he started with small inorganic compounds consisting of a few atoms, and increasingly he moved to bigger atoms and molecules, including especially the structure of the large protein molecules that were responsible for many chemical processes in the cell. And I will not go into many technical details here, but models played an important or decisive role, actually, in making sense of the data and representing the structures that he studied. And this practice built on a long-standing tradition in chemistry. Yet, to help the research efforts, Pauling, together with his colleague, Robert Corey, developed a set of purpose-built scale model. And it looks, it took the scientists more than 10 years of tinkering to develop the models that best serve the research, if you want to see. It was just more or less there. And these models, they're called space-filling models or CPK models for the three inventors, Pauling, Corey, and Calhoun, came to define the Caltech approach to structure determination. So other laboratories, for instance, the one in Cambridge, England, which I worked a lot on, have a completely different model parts, and the models look very different. And they also focus on different aspects. So these ones, they show you not the interior of the complex molecules, but the outside. The whole shape more. And so in contrast, so even if these, you can say, were really sort of designed, for a particular purpose in mind, in contrast, the colors were conventionally coded. So you have black for carbon, white for hydrogen, white for hydrogen, red for hydrogen. That's not true. That's something wrong. Blue for nitrogen. So, but it's important. They're not just colored balls, but they represent particular molecules. And now other researchers agreed that no other model was as good as the Caltech ones. And the instrument shop at Caltech started building model sets for other scientists, thus spreading the use of these models and also this particular tinker-toy aesthetic of the molecular world. And so models were useful to test different structures and for demonstrations, but there was a need to translate these 3D structures actually back into 2D representations, for instance, for representations in scientific journals, in the scholarly literature, but also in textbooks. And to render the model structure on paper, Pauling developed this increasingly close working relationship with Roger Hayward that I mentioned before. And he worked with Pauling on a freelance basis. Now, Hayward began drawing view graphs and other materials for Pauling's lecture, and later Pauling collaborated with Hayward on the publication of his textbook, General Chemistry, that went through many editions and is really the defining textbook that has this structural chemistry included, and on a number of other publications. Initially, Hayward was listed as illustrator, yet soon he appeared as co-author, highlighting the importance of his contribution to the scientific work. And here you see some examples. This is one from, this is actually a drawing of something that will go into a textbook, but why I like this version is that you see the annotations. This is still work in progress. What is particularly interesting about this particular drawing is actually that, Pauling gave Hayward very detailed instruction what he was going to draw, and then Hayward tried to do it, but in this particular case, something didn't work. And so he went back to Pauling and said, there is a problem here. And Pauling went back to his data, and sure enough, there was a problem in the calculations. So you really see how the artist is not just illustrating, he's really a collaborator in realizing this world. So that's why I like this picture particularly. And here you see perhaps the most successful collaboration between Pauling and Hayward developed around the publication of this booklet, which is called The Architecture of Molecules. This was a slim volume aimed at a broader public that Pauling intended as an introduction to the world of atoms and molecules, which he saw as a basic knowledge that everyone in the atomic age needed to have. And here you see these pastel drawings. They're really fascinating. And this was a booklet that was timed to appear at Christmas, so for broad circulation. So that's why I mention it here. The book was celebrated as, and this is a quote, perhaps the first publications where art and science were so thoroughly blended. So there would be much more to say about this collaboration, but I quickly jump to the second one. Am I have time? So Richard Dickerson joined the Caltech group just about the time Pauling left Caltech in the mid-1960s. As a postdoctoral researcher at the Laboratory of Molecular Biology at Cambridge in England, Dickerson had worked with John Kendrew on the structure of myoglobin, the molecule that stores oxygen in muscle. And this was the very first global protein structure ever to be solved at an atomic level. It got Kendrew the Nobel Prize. Now, Scientific American published an article on the pioneering work in 1961 and hired Irving Geis, who had worked as a scientific illustrator for the journal before, to draw the complex molecular structure for the piece. And here is the result. The editor, Dennis Flanagan, apparently described this thing as, this work that had took Geis 6 months and a lot of hard work to produce as a mass of crumpled chicken wire. But nevertheless, it's actually precise drawing. And nevertheless, it found its way in the journal and laid the groundwork for Guy's career as a molecular artist. Later, Jacobson, who was only a postdoc on this project, developed a very close relationship with Guy's that lasted for several decades. In course of this collaboration, Guy's developed various styles of representation that I will show you in a moment. But just before, the production of each of these pictures was a very laborious process. Guy's would travel to the model, even if this included traveling from New York to Los Angeles, and study it intensely. He would sketch and photograph the model as a way to conceptualize and finally paint it. This process was accompanied by intense conversation and much correspondence between the scientist and the artist. I'm still trying to get to some of the correspondence, which there's a problem with the archive. It's not really accessible, but it does exist, so maybe eventually. But this is an example which you also see in the exhibition. So this is this working phase, right? It has a lot of annotations by Jacobson and you know, what needs to be changed or not changed, or highlighted or not highlighted. And here you see a picture of the two of them. On this side is Irving Guy's, on the other side Richard Jacobson, working together on some proofs of one of their publications. I actually think it is the one I mentioned. So Jacobson and Guy's worked together on a textbook, The Structure and Action of Proteins. For the book that featured Guy's as co-author, the pair developed a new style of representation that highlighted the structure and action of proteins. Here you see this. So it's actually unclear who developed that style of drawing, but you know, if it was Jacobson or if it was Guy's. But as Jacobson saw it, it was never really clear whether Irv illustrated my books or I wrote Irv's captions. In the end, it did not matter. Together, we could do more than either could have done alone. And the readers seem to agree. This copiously illustrated textbook was widely used and taught generations of students, actually including myself, to think about proteins and biochemical processes more generally in structural terms. According to Jacobson, who collaborated with Guy's on many further book projects, including a similar style of illustrations, Guy's, this is a quote of an obituary from Jacobson about Guy's. He said, "Guy's taught us all how to look, how to understand, and how to show others what we saw." Now, in later drawings, Guy's shifted to an increasingly abstract and, if you want, artistic, although always stereochemically correct rendering of molecular structures that highlighted the function of the molecule rather than the position of single atoms. And he achieved this effect by working with striking colors and light effects. So this is the same molecule of this first drawing I showed you. It's still myoglobin. It's completely differently. It focuses on the active center of this molecule, which is in the center. And so here's, actually, I have more of this. This is some of the other molecules that Jacobson worked on and that were rendered in this style by Guy's. Now, by the 1890s, computer graphic programs like Frodo or MoldScript started to supplant physical modeling and molecular artists. Yet looking online at models developed with, for instance, MoldScript, it is immediately clear that the style of representation was borrowed from Guy's ribbon and arrow molecular drawing. And this is actually one reason. This is Guy's again, and this is this style of the arrow with the arrows. And it is because of the takeover of computers that actually Guy's changed his style. This highlights the fact that the fact that these computer models take over his style highlights the fact that many of the basic design features of modern modeling software rely on graphic choices made by guys and other pioneers of molecular artistry. The new techniques like virtual reality and augmented reality also are finding applications in the molecular structure field. As practitioners in the field see it, all these methods serve to make the unseen world of biology accessible, understandable, and beautiful. At the same time, they raise complex questions of artistic license, credibility, and visual literacy that is necessary to discern what is known, what is hypothesized, and what is speculative. Put differently, we can say that then as now, scientists, artists, technologies, and lay people interact to produce the molecular world as we know it. And I stop here.
Our next presenter, Brian Jacobson, is a historian of media, visual culture, and their interactions with science and technology. He is professor of visual culture here at Caltech. Brian's forthcoming book about film, energy systems, and environments is entitled The Cinema of Extractions, Film Materials and Their Forms. But he will be speaking today about golden event science in the golden age of television.
All right, thanks so much, Peter. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation and the chapter that I wrote focuses on this man. Does anyone recognize him? Yeah, Capra, Frank Capra. So in 1952, Frank Capra was inexplicably out of options. Yes, Capra, Hollywood icon, the winner of not one, not two, not three, but 6 Academy Awards for making unforgettable hits, at least back then, like It Happened One Night, Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. He was also the recipient of the Legion of Merit and the Distinguished Service Medal for his cinematic contribution to America's World War II efforts, the Why We Fight documentary series. That Capra, though, was out of options in 1952. His now perennial holiday hit, It's a Wonderful Life, had been a financial failure in 1946, dooming his independent production company, and after stringing together a few more films for MGM and Paramount, Capra decided to retire from Hollywood in 1952. But as they say, one door closes, another opens, and so too for Frank Capra. That year, a different American media behemoth came calling, and this time it was AT&T. Between 1952 and 1958, Capra produced 4 one-hour television specials for AT&T's Bell System Science series, including the one I wrote about for the Crossing Over catalog, the 1957 episode titled The Strange Case of the Cosmic Rays. With his Hollywood career on the rocks, Capra leaped headlong into the golden age of television. And he also returned in a way to his roots, which lay, importantly, not in the motion picture arts, but in fact in science. For Frank Capra was, before he was a Hollywood star, a 1918 graduate of the Troop College of Technology, future Caltech. The Strange Case of the Cosmic Rays drew upon Capra's enduring links to his alma mater, links that illustrate 3 key themes I see at work in our exhibition. First, the degree to which so many branches of science became image-driven pursuits in the 20th century. Second, how that image-driven mode, which Caltech scientists in part helped to lead, lent itself to science's popularization in image culture. And then finally, third, how Caltech, though better known, of course, for the scientific images pioneered in its labs, also made those images the basis for evocative forms of symbolic power that push science into the realms of entertainment and politics. So I only have a few minutes today to explore these themes, and I hope you'll keep them in mind maybe throughout the day. But I think telling you a little more of Capra's Caltech story can help to bring them out, and so that's what I'm going to do. Here is Caltech Capra, who entered Troup College with dreams of becoming an engineer, who signed up for a chemistry degree and initially excelled in his courses. He earned high marks and a travel scholarship that notably took him, among other places, to the Eastman Film Manufacturing Plant in Rochester, New York, where he could see early on motion picture art's scientific backdrop up close. But Capra never quite took to the science curriculum, and instead he found greater interest and success in 4 years of English courses taken in what would become, in 1925, Caltech's Division of the Humanities. All right, there we go. Writing in 1918 in the campus newspaper, the Troup Tech, Capra went so far as to insist, and this is a quote, that the English language courses at Troup are ones for which we should have the deepest regard. Otherwise, we may tend to become mere thinking machines instead of warm, appreciative human beings. As an English student, Capra cobbled together the foundations for a film career. In addition to his literature classes, he began writing short stories, some of which appeared in the Tech. He learned photography from a Tech staff photographer and movie buff who helped develop photographic plates at the Carnegie Institution's Mount Wilson Observatory, and became a lifelong friend and collaborator. Up at Mount Wilson, Capra met a newsreel cameraman who, in turn, initiated him into the art of motion picture photography. Now, despite his later Hollywood success, though, Capra never totally got over his brush with science, even lamenting late in life that he had not followed in the footsteps of his early idol, astronomer Edwin Hubble, who began working at Mount Wilson the year after Capra graduated. A movie director is not as important as an astronomer, Capra told biographer Joseph McBride. But we might ask, did Capra really need to choose between astronomy and art? Such statements, I think, obscure the degree to which Capra's career frequently, and perhaps always, operated at the juncture of science and motion picture art. Lost in the distinction between what Capra referred to as the more respectable path of science and the warm, appreciative, humanistic route he found in his English studies is the significant role that visually oriented sciences like astronomy played in leading Capra into film. The research undertaken at Mount Wilson, for example, depended upon the image-driven practice developed by the observatory's founder, George Ellery Hale, and his spectroheliograph, an instrument for photographing the sun in monochromatic light. It's no coincidence that Capra found common interest there and later put it in his first AT&T effort, the 1956 episode titled Our Mr. Sun. Here on campus, meanwhile, another visual practice had similarly important results and influence on Capra. This time it was the study of subatomic particles, which again involved taking photos, this time of the environment created in a device called the cloud chamber. In 1936, Caltech professor and former PhD student Carl Anderson received the Nobel Prize in Physics for his 1932 discovery of the positron, a discovery achieved and confirmed through photography. Historian of science Peter Gallison calls images like Anderson's photo, the one you see here, he calls them golden events, a form of evidence, that is, for a scientific tradition that depended upon the production of images of such clarity that a single picture could serve as evidence for a new entity like the positron or a new effect. For Capra, I argue in the chapter in the catalog, these golden events were perfectly suited for the golden age of television. Educated in Caltech's image-focused scientific setting, Capra made its images the basis for his science films. In The Strange Case of the Cosmic Rays, which I will say you can watch on YouTube if you're interested, and I will tell you from teaching students this film, it's really enjoyable. They always think, oh really, I have to watch a 50-minute TV episode on YouTube, and then they always come back and say, oh, it was so fun and wonderful, so I encourage you to watch it. In this episode, Capra turns the search for subatomic particles, including the positron, into a kind of detective story, with a panel of judges who are played by marionette figures of Charles Dickens, Edgar Allan Poe, and Fyodor Dostoevsky, who must decide whether the story of finding these cosmic rays might be the best detective story of the century. Turning scientists into detectives and subatomic particles into furtive suspects, the episode's entertainment value rests largely on these animated sequences, but it's also full of photographs, film footage, and real data collected for years and assembled in part at Caltech by Carl Anderson himself. Now, The Strange Case of the Cosmic Rays aired on October 25th, 1957, and it received generally positive reviews from critics, many of whom noted the significance of the fact that the Sputnik satellite, launched 3 weeks earlier by the Soviet Union, was orbiting overhead at the time of the release. The Soviet connection gave Americans a chance to consider how scientific research was being mobilized for Cold War military dominance and all its atomic age risks. But if science's image tradition succeeded in no small part because cloud chamber photographs made for good public relations, as Peter Gallison argues, here we find Capra in his AT&T films reaching back to his own science education, trading precisely on that same blend of scientific documentation and good PR. Bringing the cloud chamber and the story and significance of its discoveries to the television studio and science photography to the small screen, Capra made Caltech's golden events a player in television's golden age and a lasting model for those interested in how scientific discourse becomes, with the shrewd, always self-interested oversight of powerful corporations like AT&T, public knowledge. That knowledge, as Capra's story helps illustrate, is so often achieved through the perfect blend of science and art. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. So now I get to introduce our third presenter in this session. Lois Rosson is a historian at the NASA History Office and an expert on depictions of outer space. Her 2022 dissertation at UC Berkeley was entitled The Astronomical Realists, The Social Mechanics of Visual Documentation, Art, and the American Space Age, 1944 to 1987. And her presentation for us today is related to that research and to the history of documentation of space at JPL and beyond. Lois, please.
Hello. Thank you so much to Peter for that very gracious introduction and to all of you for coming here on a Saturday morning. As Peter mentioned, I am a field historian in the NASA History Office, but the book project that I'm working on is really about how Los Angeles exerted a special impact on the look of the space environment over the course of the second half of the 20th century. And so the essay that I contributed to the PST catalog that Caltech put together is really about a special sort of raindrop, forest in the trees moment in the late 1970s where science fiction and science come together to really illustrate this relationship that Los Angeles has to the depiction of space in both the popular imaginary but also the scientific. So I don't know how many of you guys identify as science fiction fans, but the late 1970s were a pretty blockbuster set of years for big sci-fi franchises. 1977, George Lucas releases the first installment of Star Wars. It's also the same year that Voyagers 1 and 2 are launched. The success of the Star Wars franchise prompts executives at Paramount to revisit an earlier science fiction franchise, Star Trek, which ran for only 3 seasons in the 1960s and then was canceled. The success of Star Wars basically convinced executives to give Star Trek another college try. And so in 1979, the Star Trek film was released, Star Trek, which brought the franchise into movie theaters. And so I'm setting this scene because by 1979, a show that you guys are probably familiar with, Cosmos, A Personal Voyage, also enters production. And the reason why all of these different entities I think are important to situate in one particular temporal moment is because they really represent how difficult it is to untangle art from science in a lot of these examples. When I was working on this project, the analogy that I came back to often was thinking about art and science in their sort of discrete forms as like a ball of yellow and blue Play-Doh. And when you mix the Play-Doh together, for a minute, it'll look like both yellow and blue Play-Doh in one ball, right? But after a certain point, those things are gonna mix to become a green ball of Play-Doh, an independent third thing. So in 1979, Cosmos enters production. A lot of the people who are working in the art department on Star Trek, Star Wars, go to work for Carl Sagan in the art department for Cosmos, working on pedagogically accurate representations of the space environment. And this is an interesting moment also too in just the history and politics of space science. Many people know Carl Sagan as sort of the 1970s man of science. And Cosmos actually was a pretty political piece of television programming. Carl Sagan was he was a member of the space science community who was a little bit disappointed in sort of the lack of momentum that was maintained after the completion of the Apollo program. And really, Cosmos was sort of an attempt to go directly to the American taxpayer to make the case that space science and space exploration was a fundamentally worthy pursuit, right? So as I mentioned, Voyagers 1 and 2 launch in 1977. Cosmos enters production in 1979. Carl Sagan is working to visualize the space environment in a way that is inspiring to public audiences at the same time that Voyager is revealing the outer parts of the solar system to us in new ways. And that's really what this essay is about, is sort of how that information that was being gleaned from these remote robotic explorers was then cohered into visual information that Carl Sagan and people like Carl Sagan could defend as pedagogically trustworthy at the same time that they could use it as something awe-inspiring and to defend the worthiness of this as a scientific pursuit. So how did he do that? The art department for Cosmos was a very robust place. They filmed Cosmos, they developed a show at KCET in Hollywood. The photo here on the right is John Lomberg, who was the art director for Cosmos. He was also the art director for the Golden Record, which I can talk more about in the Q&A. But the production team on Cosmos made a conscious decision to keep all of the artistic production in-house as opposed to contracting it out to the different special effects agencies that exist in Los Angeles, precisely because they wanted to defend this claim of the images that they were constructing and circulating as scientifically accurate. And I mentioned this already, but a lot of the actual artists and illustrators, so people who went to art school, who worked on this production team, came from art departments of the other science fiction franchises of the time. So Don Davis, you can see like in the back here, and Rick Sternbach, who is in some of these photographs, worked on Star Wars and then also on Star Trek 2. This is a model of Valles Marineris that was constructed from both Mariner and Viking images. I love these images because they really speak to the tactile materialization of these views of the cosmos that were circulated on this television program. These people were literally just making these landscapes out of styrofoam and then cross-checking them with images that were taken by remote robotic observers. And it's very much like in Soraya's presentation, this is an iterative process, right, where people like Carl Sagan and his allies in the field of astronomy are weighing in on occasion on the accuracy of this set of images. And I have had the chance to interview a lot of the people who worked in this art department, and their direct experiences are endlessly fascinating. This is, once again, John Lomberg, who was a really talented airbrush artist. And I like this image, too, because it emphasizes the handmade quality of these images. while Carl Sagan could have easily used the images that we were getting back from Voyager, the art department did consciously include this sort of handmade artistic element. The image that I should have included was an image that Lomborg, one of his most famous sequences that he contributed to the show, was of strands of human DNA overlaid onto the galaxy. In Lomborg's own words, he was really invested in portraying the cosmos as an extension of nature, right? Not that, because sometimes we tend to think of nature as something that exists on Earth, and Earth is suspended in space, which represents this void. But part of the political project of Cosmos was really making this environmentalist claim that, no, actually, space is a continuation of nature, and if we demonstrate human DNA and other natural elements in this environment, that's a way to make the case to our viewers. Okay, so what does this have to do with science? There's a ton of literature on scientific communication that tries to dispel the notion of the center-out model of science comms, where in that model you have a scientific institution that's doing scientific work and it's releasing information about the scientific work that it's doing, and then culture writ large will take that information and then communicate it, right? It's sort of a unidirectional model. Most of the work in this area that's come out in the last 20 years has advocated for something that's a little bit more bidirectional. I think these things are even more entangled. And I think that the best example of this is the visualizations of the Voyager 2 encounters that Jim Blinn produced at the computer graphics lab at the Jet Propulsion Lab. So what ends up happening is Cosmos enters production in 1979. There's an entire production studio of artists that are working on these visualizations of the space environment. John Lomborg is getting in his car to drive to Pasadena from Hollywood to get images that we're getting from Voyager, as they're coming in, to drive back to incorporate them into this programming. But then at the same time, Jim Blinn is also working to visualize all of this information. And so Jim Blinn, for those of you who don't know, was a computer graphics pioneer, and some of the most I think, mesmerizing visual content that comes out of the Voyager encounters are these early computer graphics animations of the Voyager flybys. And so Jim Blinn ends up getting funding from the Cosmos production team to produce these animations. And not only does the funding come from Cosmos, but he also uses the artistic talent that's cohered there. So Rick Sternbach and Don Davis, two of the artists that I mentioned earlier, actually go to work for Jim Blinn to do the texture mapping that then becomes the actual celestial spheres in these flyby animations. And the image on the left is an example of anamorphic drawing, which is Rick Sternbach actually turned me onto in one of our interviews because that was the closest analog that he could think of to this process of texture mapping. So an anamorphic drawing is a drawing that you do very smeared out. And then if you put some sort of reflective object in the center, then suddenly the shape of the image, produces a coherent picture. And that was how he described working on these texture maps, right? And the anamorphic drawing is, I'm not an art historian, but I'm sure we have art historians in the room that could talk to us more about this. But anamorphic drawings are this very interesting example, right, of art as technology that, gets articulated in, medieval and Renaissance art practice. So I think that there is sort of a poetry to all of this. So all of this to say, I think this is a really interesting example of how art can function as a technology for helping us know stuff better, but also the complexity of teasing apart where the art starts and where the science stops. And so to return back to this Plato analogy that I really like, right? I think that this is an example of art and science combining in a way that we're getting more of a third new thing as opposed to just overlapping concepts in the same place. So yeah, happy to answer more questions in the Q&A, and thank you guys so much for your attention.
Our next presenter is Christopher Hawthorne. Christopher is an architecture critic. He has been architecture critic for the Los Angeles Times and the first chief design officer of the city of Los Angeles. And he is now senior critic at Yale School of Architecture. Christopher has also received Emmy Awards for his documentary That Far Corner, Frank Lloyd Wright in Los Angeles, and his Artbound episode, Third LA. And in his presentation today, he will turn his attention on Caltech's campus.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Peter and Claudia for their leadership in organizing the exhibition, the catalog, and this series of conversations today. Really happy to be in such fantastic company. So, as Peter mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the campus architecture of Caltech. I am trying to not make any too easy comparisons between that architecture and the scientific research, particularly on a metaphorical level that happens within those buildings. I will leave that to the scientists and the historians of science who are on much firmer ground there. I want to focus on the evolution of Caltech's campus and perhaps offer some thoughts, as I do in my chapter in the catalog, about where campus planning and architecture might turn next at Caltech. So, I was very happy to hear from Peter. I did not actually know that today's events were part of the Michener series. And a professor of mine at Yale, Vincent Scully, in the 90s, just at the time that I was studying with him, in fact, visited Caltech for the first time as a Michener distinguished lecturer. He came back a couple of years later as a visiting professor. So I think he enjoyed his time here as a Michener lecturer. And he offered some comments, and I quote from that talk early in my chapter, talking about and we'll come back to this notion at the end of my slides, the college campus as a theater for human action. So I want you to keep that metaphor in mind, and I want you to keep in mind the notion of if the campus is a kind of stage set or a theater, who are the protagonists of that drama? And the protagonists have shifted over time depending on the influence of various figures in the history of Caltech, and I'm going to talk about three of those figures in particular. Now, if I had to give you, that is a really bright green in how this turned out. This is super neon. If I had to give you an accelerated history of the architecture and the campus planning of Caltech, I would do so by having you think about three axes of development in particular. So the first, Caltech's early development starting in the 1920s, extending to 1930, is along this axis parallel to California and just north of California, moving from Wilson on the west or the left of the image to Hill on the east or the right of the image. And then in the post-war period, a really strong new axis of development, and we'll show some examples of the buildings that were produced as part of this shift to the north through the center of campus, including the building that we're in now, Baxter, Beckman Labs across the way, its sibling or twin, and then, of course, the Beckman auditorium, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And then finally, over in recent years, another east-west axis toward Del Mar, toward the northern edge of the campus, which begins with, I don't think I have a pointer here, but begins with the Broad Center around 2002, Chen, a newer building just to the north, and then moving past the Annenberg building by Frederick Fisher and some other projects that are at the top right of this map. But the story is different at Caltech than it would be at other college campuses because of the nature of the research that's happening here. So before we get to the particular figures who have had such an influence on the campus development here, I do want to acknowledge a couple of things that make the architecture of a place like Caltech different. And that is the particular scale of and kind of research that's happening behind the walls of these buildings, digging into the earth, as the case with the Celestat drawings, or another Russell Porter drawing. Palomar also thinking about the ways in which there is this sort of archipelago of research sites, which, although not on campus, of course, are connected to the research and in some ways the architectural development of what's happening on campus. Russell Porter, who produced both of these images, this one trained as an architect at MIT, so connected to that history of Hayward and Geis and others about whom we've already heard. So there's also a strong role of architects working directly with scientists who are active on campus. But in terms of digging into the earth, looking into microscopes, looking into the molecular level, and then looking to the skies, of course, there was a way in which the campus architecture on campus here should be thought of as a kind of locus of a larger group of research initiatives and missions. We might mention Mount Wilson, of course, as sort of Caltech adjacent research facility. And then, although I won't touch on it too much, I do want to just mention the work of Beatrix Farrand and the role of landscape on the Caltech campus. I think one of the things that Peter is interested in getting into is the specific relationship of Caltech and what's happening here to Southern California, and certainly climate, the role of landscape, and in campus planning, particularly in the early years, the relationship of built and unbuilt, let's say architectural and planted space, is particularly crucial here in giving the campus the character, the particular character that it has. But my chapter in the book really argues that there are three figures we should think about as having had a greater influence on the architecture and the development of Caltech than any others. The first is an architect, Bertram Goodhue. The second is a scientist himself, a Caltech graduate and a donor and a trustee, a patron and philanthropist, Arnold Beckman. And then the third is a president, David Baltimore, who had quite a bit to say about campus planning and the selection of particular architects. So to begin with Goodhue, really there is a sort of animating moment in my chapter, which is when Hale travels to San Diego to see the Panama, California Exposition in 1915, before Caltech is known as Caltech, while it's still known as Troop. And that exposition was designed by Bertram Goodhue, and at that point was an architect who was very little known on the West Coast. Hale decides then and there that Goodhue is a genius and needs to be installed at Caltech to help guide this nascent institution. And as a result of Hale's enthusiastic recommendation, Goodhue is in place on the Caltech campus by later that year, before the year 1915 is out, and begins developing the first versions of a campus plan. It was not the first. It's important to say that Goodhue's work is bracketed by two important developments. One is an earlier plan by Myron Hunt and Elmer Gray, from which Goodhue borrows a number of ideas. And then later, after Goodhue passes away relatively early in 1924 on the east side of campus, so the sort of top of this image following Goodhue is work that by Gordon Kaufman that culminates in the Athenaeum of 1930. But this is really the plan that gives the first form to what we might think of as quintessential Caltech architecture. And one of the areas of focus in my chapter, and what I want to focus a little bit on this morning as well, is the role that these arcades, you might also think of them as porticos, that run in front of the buildings that Goodhue produced after finishing that master plan in 1917, 1918. And the early buildings that come out of that plan are connected by these shaded porticos that run in front of the buildings and bring them together in a sort of unified way and create a kind of architectural ensemble that is then carried through in later work by Kaufman and others in very profound ways. And what's particularly useful about this one gesture is that it brings together buildings inside of which all kinds of different kinds of scientific research at all kinds of different scales, from the microscope to the wind tunnel, is happening, and provides a kind of coherence that also has the effect of bringing a kind of human-centered pedestrian scale to the campus, which I think we can all recognize is one of the things that allows Caltech's campus to stand out in its architecture. So I mentioned Gordon Kaufman. So after Goodhue passes away in 1924, Goodhue's successor firm continues to work quite a bit on the Caltech campus. But the eastern half of that first axis that I showed you is handed over to Gordon Kaufman, also the architect of the LA Times building, by the way, as well as Hoover Dam, I think a really underrated architect who is doing lots of institutional and federal work, as well as his fantastic work here at Caltech, which includes a number of residential dormitory buildings extending east along that axis, and then, as I mentioned, culminating in the Athenaeum of 1930. As we begin to turn north, that central axis that I mentioned as a kind of post-war, as the focus of post-war development, the most prominent of those buildings is the Beckman Auditorium. And here we begin to see a shift in influence from an architect, Goodhue, or architects, let's say Goodhue, his successors, Gordon Kaufman, to individual donors who begin to have a certain kind of prominence. Now, Beckman's prominence is really singular because of his role, connections to Caltech, his role as a scientist, and also as a donor. And head of the Board of Trustees in a pivotal decade of Caltech expansion. But Beckman Auditorium, this sort of one of the first examples in this part of the world of what architectural historians call the new formalism in the middle 60s, is part of that extension and part of buildings departing from that sort of ensemble, those connections that were so important to the earlier architects who sort of stamped the original campus architecture. And that culminates in one of the first attempts during the postmodern period of the 1980s, to the extent that there have been some attempts to look back to that Goodhue and Kaufman, various spins on the Spanish colonial. It happens most dramatically, and I think most unfortunately, in my view, in the Beckman Institute, which blows up those Spanish colonial references to kind of cartoonish scale. And I show this slide also to suggest the ways in which the arcade idea, the portico idea, is sort of recalled in purely formal rather than circulation in terms of a way of moving through the campus or as a way to bring buildings together. So as you'll notice that the arcade here becomes pushed inside the building, becomes flush with it. It is part of a sort of self-referential collection of architectural symbols. It doesn't lead you anywhere. It doesn't connect to another building except as a passageway through the building and under, but it doesn't do what those earlier Goodhue and Kaufman arcades and porticos do, which is bring those different architectures together in a kind of single embrace. This is very much a self-contained kind of architecture. And so to go back to this image to suggest the ways in which that happens, again, you have this sort of connected gesture along a horizontal plane as distinct from the image that we just looked at. By the time that David Baltimore becomes president in 1997, the influence begins to turn from an individual donor or patron to the president himself, and Baltimore is quite explicit, even on becoming president, that he's very interested in bringing prominent architects to campus. That begins with the Broad Center, which I mentioned before, produced by I.M. Pei's firm. James Ingo Fried is the partner in charge on that project. And that building is the meeting of the minds between Baltimore and Eli Broad. And Eli Broad, if you know his patronage as an architectural supporter across Los Angeles, beyond Caltech, he was very interested in working with blue chip architects, always is interested in bringing in winners of the Pritzker Prize, the sort of loose equivalent of the Nobel Prize in the world of architecture. And that collaboration between Pei's firm, James Ingo Fried, and Baltimore and Broad on that first building was an example of where campus planning was turning. And it culminates, I think this period culminates in a building that breaks sort of from that axial pattern that I had been describing, Cahill Center on the south side of California, marked in red here, by Tom Main in the Los Angeles office. Morphosis, another winner of the Pritzker Prize. Here's a model of that project. And although I would say the more recent major projects on the campus, including the Resnick, which is probably the newest of that group, have made attempts to be a little bit more contextual, perhaps, than Cahill, and return an emphasis to pedestrian scale to a degree. They very much bear the marks of the legacies twin of both Beckman and David Baltimore in terms of being largely standalone buildings which exist within their own architectural spheres of influence. And what I argue at the end of the chapter, and getting back to that Scully quote where I began, is really that one useful path forward for Caltech in terms of campus planning might be to return to that Scully metaphor of thinking of the campus as a theater for human action, and think about ways to recover some important elements of the Goodhue sensibility that we saw in that first drawing, which is to say, thinking of how buildings might be connected and thought of as ensembles. This is practically a difficult set of questions, of course, because the way that donor relationships work, the way that capital is brought together for individual buildings is, of course, quite different than it was a century ago. Nonetheless, I think that spirit, rather than the stylistic sort of recovery that we would see in Beckman Institute, looking back to formal cues or to signs and symbols of the Spanish colonial as a way to return to Goodhue, we might find a more productive celebration of that earlier Goodhue plan by thinking about ensembles of buildings that might be connected. I think particularly given the climate crisis, the need to think as carefully about shade and pedestrian circulation as the Goodhue and Kaufman buildings do, it might also be a timely strategy from that point of view as well. So look forward to talking about all those things more. Thank you.
So I'm going to ask all of our presenters to come up as a panel and sit with me here at the table. And I'll ask one or two questions, but we'll also take some questions in a moment from those of you in the audience. Hello again. So there are a number of themes that I was thinking about that might come together in this panel in advance, and most of them I already heard in your talks, and I don't want to ask questions that ask you to repeat yourself. But one thread that I'm curious to hear more about is a sense of place. That one thread that I think came up for each of you, but that maybe we can draw some connections between, is how the visual culture of science at Caltech and of the campus of Caltech, and we can include JPL within Caltech and its own campus, which we haven't heard so much about yet, the ways in which those are products of their Southern California environment. So any thoughts along those lines?
I can take a quick stab. I'm not a historian of science, so I will await answers from my colleagues here. I think one thing that is really apparent in all of the discussions luring scientists and architects here in the early part of the campus planning that I was focusing on is just the particular geography of this part of Southern California, the connection to nearby mountains where observatories might be placed, and also the clarity of the skies, the weather is part of that as well. That has as much as anything to do with why Caltech is where it is.
Brian, please.
If I can. I think it's important to remember, and I talked about this in the presentation, but not so much in the chapter, that Hale comes to California because it's a good place to see, right? It's a good place to be able to see the stars better, right, than other places. And so in a way, it's no coincidence that then the image tradition would have such a firm foundation here at Caltech, a place where it is possible to see better than other places. And then the other piece of that then is, that's the same moment virtually, right, within about a decade that Hollywood is established as the filmmaking center of the world, right, around 1910 and moving into the teens. And so we have the coincidence here of the arrival of scientists looking for a place where it's a good place to see the world, and filmmakers arriving to find a good place to make images of the world. And those two things come together so incredibly in the figure of Capra, but I think Capra signals something more about the connections between these two pursuits.
So I look specifically at astronomical illustrators who are interested in crafting a new professional identity, right? That the astronomical illustrator is like a new type of scientific image maker. Of course, this is like the image that these actors are articulating is a very 20th century version of something older, but the landscape of Southern California figures so prominently in this vision of outer space that they're articulating. And I hammered this a little bit in the presentation, but the thing that these astronomical illustrators are interested in doing is circulating an image of the space environment that they can then defend as comparatively more accurate than something that could be, cast aside as the product of artistic whimsy, right? In my interviews with all these people, the thing that I discovered was that the way that they were making these accurate representations was just by traveling around the American Southwest and largely in Southern California to just go and look at the rocks. They defended the practice by making this assessment that, if physics is continuous throughout the universe, which we are pretty sure it is, then it stands to reason that any sort of physical processes that would shape other planets, right, are also visible here on Earth. So if you just go to places where the geology is very visible, right, and this is, I think, similar to what you're saying, Brian, then it will just inform, right, what is a plausible view of the shape of things on other planets. So, Death Valley is a very frequent site for a lot of the illustrators in this story, like when they want to go and set eyes on something that is truly alien looking. But then, and I think that there's also examples of, the landscapes of Southern California kind of becoming more internal to the scientific process too. I'm thinking, I don't know if any of you guys have ever been to the Mars Yard out at the Jet Propulsion Lab, but it's like a simulation of the Martian surface, and we use it to test rovers. But that's it's like we're manufacturing these landscapes, in these places. And then the other example I was thinking of, I didn't have a chance to bring this up in the presentation, but I wish I would have, Christopher, because Chesley Bonestell was also trained as an architect and then worked in Hollywood. But his most famous painting, Saturn as seen from Titan, which he painted in 1947. It's a model that he built and then photographed, but he painted it when he was living in Los Angeles. So the actual dirt of Titan in this extremely famous illustration in the sort of astronomical illustration tradition is literally made out of Los Angeles. He literally dug the dirt up in his yard in Los Angeles, and it stands in for Titan in this really famous image. So the recursiveness, I think, is endlessly fascinating.
For me, this is more difficult because, I described how these models are specific for Caltech, but I can't say that they represent the landscape. But then, of course, this atomic science has very much shaped a style, which is this atomic style, and this, coming together with the space style, and which we could find around, which we find very strongly around Los Angeles, but not so much specifically on this campus, but we did discuss a bit. It comes also, I don't know, the atomic clock, it comes in lamps, in furnishing, in the whole mid-century modern. You see a very strong, these metals with the bowls, you see it in many of the furnitures, the colors. So that fits together very well, but I don't think it's so much in this colonial revival on campus, right?
No, there's maybe some hints to atomic architecture, a kind of subset of mid-century modern, but not in a building itself. I also think it's worth just quickly mentioning, Brian mentioned Hollywood. In terms of my interest in the patronage that helped shape the campus, we should mention oil also. So the fortunes in 20th century LA are made first by oil and then by real estate. So you see that in architecture and in patronage here. The reason Frank Lloyd Wright comes to Southern California is first to see that same expo in 1915, but then also because he thinks that Doheny in particular, but some of these new oil millionaires will be architectural patrons. And the first really substantial architectural work he does in Los Angeles is what most historians think is a group of speculative proposals for Doheny Ranch above Beverly Hills. And then in the post-war period, of course, later in the 20th century, and Eli Broad is probably the great exemplar of this, the fortunes are made in real estate and home building in particular, and that sort of ways in which suburban subdivisions are built all across Southern California, and that wealth then returns to a certain degree at Caltech, and then really returns in downtown Los Angeles along Grand Avenue, for example.
I want to give the rest of you opportunities for questions as well. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand. Back here, yeah. And then Claudia's second.
This is more for Christopher. I think you mentioned that the architecture represents the student body or something like that. If the architecture represents them, how does it serve them? And I mean that by, when I went to Seattle and I went to the Cool House Library, I felt like I was being pushed to move around the library. How does the buildings at Caltech, past and present, sort of represent what helps the students?
Thank you for that question. I think the argument I make in the end of the chapter is that maybe it's time to think about how to return students and scientists to the place that they once had on campus as the chief protagonists of that drama, if we want to continue with the Scully metaphor. And at least architecturally, we had donors, administrators, and architects themselves really beginning to take that spotlight. And I think what's really remarkable about that early campus planning is the way that you can move from one building beneath those arcades along those porticos, you can move from one building to the next without even realizing that there's a threshold. It's a sort of continuous and very easy passage that does offer a lot of pedestrian freedom. But then there's research that's quite distinct going on in each of those buildings, but there's a kind of consistency of experience just as a pedestrian, certainly as a student, to be moving around the campus, I would imagine, in that, let's say, on the southern half of the campus in particular.
I know Claudia had a question as well, and we have a microphone on its way. Thank you, Bailey.
Thank you, Bailey. Hi, I was taken by Brian's comment just a few minutes ago that California is a place to see. I just love that line, and I'm going to steal it from here on out. But listening to all of you and knowing I'm the curator of the exhibition, so I should be fully transparent, is that you would think that California and LA in particular would have been an ideal place for Caltech then to embrace the arts completely, like, say, MIT has done in other places where the arts really become an integral part of what the institution does. Yet that hasn't happened. Why?
So I have many thoughts on this, but I'm going to ask our panelists for thoughts on this.
I teach a class here called The Art of Science, and for the past 4 years, I've been asking our students to ponder this question, I suppose. And I think, we don't have an answer. I do think that what we tend to come back to are two factors. And I'll add a third one, and then I'll ask Christopher to comment on it. The first is the size of Caltech. I think the small size of Caltech tends to be the explaining factor for everything. Any problem you might have, any complaint you have about Caltech, the answer will always be, well, we're just too small for whatever that thing is that you want. And I think in the case of the arts, that is one explanation, that we just are too small. The second part of it is connected to that, and that is the mission. What is the mission of Caltech? The mission of Caltech is to do cutting-edge scientific research, and you must explain then how the arts would be integral to that practice. The third reason, and I think that it's been illustrated well today, maybe, and if we want to make a distinction between MIT and Caltech, it's that MIT has an architecture school, and it did from very early on. And as we've seen, architecture programs are where you have really concrete, not to use a pun here, but concrete connections between art and science and engineering. And in the absence of that at Caltech, we lose an opportunity. Where MIT has an easy opportunity, we lack that opportunity. And I think that is a really critical factor in why Caltech hasn't had a reason to do it. So those would be my three explanations.
I would agree with that. I would first of all recommend Jennifer Watts's chapter in the catalog on the history of the Baxter Art Gallery in this building as a kind of a case study in how these issues have played out in the history of Caltech. And then I think when I first moved, I used to live down the block. I used to live in this neighborhood, and when I first moved here, I kind of had a sense of Caltech as being just a kind of smaller MIT, and I couldn't have been more wrong. It's not just about size, as Brian has pointed out. It's also about a completely different mission, about pure science, pure research, as opposed to applied department. So not an architecture school, not an engineering department, in the same way that has been a partner of MIT's architecture program. So it's a very different way of understanding the institution. And the architecture department at MIT, for example, is connected with, supported by, and supportive of a number of other departments that are doing both research and applied work. So it's just a completely different animal, it seems to me, for better and worse.
I came to see a talk here a couple weeks ago. It was Kip Thorne and Leah Halloran when they were on their book tour. And Kip said that his favorite, maybe not his favorite, he said the most useful class that he took while he was a student at Caltech was perspective drawing, which I thought was so interesting. But he said that it was because it taught him how to spatially orient all of stuff that is fundamentally conceptual. And I think, a lot of the illustrators that I write about, a lot of the illustrations that they make, they actually reject the label of art and art making. They don't actually think what they're doing is fine art, precisely because they had to work so hard to circulate these images as scientifically authoritative, right? And so I think that, I don't know, I feel like my answer to that question takes a slightly different tack, in that, I feel so allergic to this binary of art and science that we continue to reify, right? And I think if I had one bone to pick with the Getty PST show, it's that it's, a show that's designed to sort of illustrate how squishy all these categories are, and yet the very framing of it really sort of, I think, just reinforces that. And so, I think that sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I think that the arts and cultural dimensions are there, we just have to excavate them.
Yeah, maybe I would also go in this direction, in the sense that actually even our presentation today, especially showed that the artists, architects and so on, and draftsmen and filmmakers, and I don't know, are in the picture. They are just not in Baxter Gallery, or they are not in a special department. But the science that is made here, and also the impact of the science, is very much connected to this other world. And we just have to find it, as maybe we did a bit in this exhibition.
I just have a quick thought. Nobody mentioned Charles and Ray Eames this morning, but we certainly might have. And I think, going back to the comments about Hollywood, that all the presentations this morning sort of suggested to me this alternate history of image production, and this gets back to the question, I think, that Caltech and the scientific world in Southern California more broadly have a really compelling story to tell about the ways in which they have produced images that have completely reordered the world, or our understanding of the world, and yet they have, for all kinds of reasons, including Caltech's sort of allergy to promoting itself, which is something I admire about it, but is swamped by the image production that's coming out of Hollywood. And this has specifically architectural implications. I recommend the great Tom Anderson documentary, Los Angeles Plays Itself, if anyone's interested in the ways in which Hollywood sort of uses and abuses images of Los Angeles itself. And so running below that, always out of the spotlight, just because of the intensity of the spotlight that Hollywood is putting out, is this incredible alternate history of image making that comes from the same landscape, the same territory. And that's one of the remarkable things about the show and the catalog, I think, is really, and the presentations by my colleagues today, is illuminating how profound that work was.
If I can just say one last thing in response to Lois's great point about the framing of Getty PST, collide, right, has really, I think, been criticized by a lot of people. And I asked my students what would be a better way to describe it. And there were some very funny ideas that I loved, but one was that, in fact, it should have been framed as a romantic comedy. Art and science, will they, won't they? Or art and science, friends with benefits. I think it gets to Lois's point. And I think one last thing, I think we can pat ourselves on the back here, and we can pat Peter and Claudia on the back for framing our exhibition as crossing over, I think, which actually captures more powerfully the way the relationship has actually functioned at Caltech and other places.
Hybridity. Okay, I'll explain the title. Yes, so the title of our exhibition and catalog, Crossing Over, is a term from biology. It's specifically a term coined by Thomas Hunt Morgan, who in 1928 founded Caltech's Division of Biology, and by Elith Cattell, a member of his team in his laboratory, in an article that they published in, I think, something like 1912. So it was while they were at Columbia University before they came to Caltech. And they used this term crossing over to describe something that happens when chromosomes come together, and when chromosomes from two organisms come together through sexual reproduction to form some hybrid, there are situations where the strands of DNA cross over each other and flip or break or pivot, and it creates a new organism with some of the genes of each of its parents. And so I think we can think of the images that make up this exhibition and the images that we've seen today as organisms with some of the genes of artistic and scientific parents. But that hybridity might go all the way down. I think one of the things is, are there pure artists or pure scientists, right? I think the hybridity is there from the beginning in the traditions that come together in these stories. Do we have any other questions? Many. Okay, Bailey, your pick, please.
You woke up. You woke them up.
Yes.
Whatever you said, that was very effective.
Art and science collide question. I was looking at the Resnick building, which is supposed to be for sustainability stuff, and I was thinking of the Broad Museum in Grand Avenue. It has a superficial similarity on the outside, but I'm hoping to hear more about the sustainability features that might be integral to that building, the Resnick building. And I thought the designers or architects, Yazdani Studio of Canon Design, so I thought it was intriguing.
Yes, so that's a design studio, Yazdani Studio, within a larger office called Canon Design. And speaking of patrons, the same Resnicks who underwrote a building by Renzo Piano on the LACMA campus several years ago. I will be walking over later today to see the completed building. I haven't seen it. I was, before leaving, I was on the design review, design commission for the city of Pasadena, and that was a project that came before us a number of times. And so I got to know it before it was under construction, but I'm very eager to see it completed. I think you are seeing, yes, there is a similarity in terms of a sort of updated version of what architects call a brise soleil, or a kind of sunshade, as both a form of ornament on the exterior of the building, but also as a way to modulate the amount of sunlight that's coming in as a way to control the temperature and ideally lower the use of air conditioning in the summer. So I think it's a building with a lot of potential. I haven't seen it completed, as I said, so I'll reserve final judgment, but it has a lot of promise, yeah.
And I see other hands. Please.
A comment. I was talking to Chuck Seitz, Professor Emeritus of Caltech. I asked him about chip design. Was it mostly craft or how much art? Mm-hmm. And he said he had an exhibit here with some of his students and their chip designs on large posters. And his professorial friend came over and looked at 4 of them and said, 4 Mozarts?
Thank you.
Hello. I was wondering about the intentionality of both the campus layout as well as the architecture of buildings in getting serendipitous neighbors to get more of the friction of what you're talking about, like the art and sciences, perhaps between sciences or whatever other kind of thing. I wonder about the intentionality of the design.
Can you tell me a little bit more what you're getting at?
Well, I'm thinking you talked about the first presentation was about art and the chemistry coming together with the pictures, mm-hmm. But there seems to me like if you mix even nuclear physics and atmosphere, you find the frictions of how the flows or viscosities interact. I was just wondering, is there intentionality between the disciplines being brought together?
I see. So I would be very interested to hear. That's something I think my colleagues would have more to say on, whether there's more intermixing of departments within single buildings than there used to be. I don't know.
This was one thing I was really fascinated by in your presentation, Christopher, your point that I'm losing all my architectural terminology, but the walkways that are shaded.
Yeah, arcades or
absolutely, thank you. That the arcades connect buildings. I think Caltech is very proud of interdisciplinarity between the sciences, and I think the arcades may at least be a representation of that interdisciplinarity, but maybe even a tool for fostering it, because it is possible for a scientist to leave their building and go visit a neighbor without the sunlight beating down upon them, right?
The other thing is scale. We haven't really talked about this in architectural terms, but we were talking about the relative small size of Caltech. That really has an impact in terms of the success of the campus architecturally. So Caltech has a loose version of the Oxbridge model that Yale has residential colleges, but in the New Haven setting, they're separated, and the architect of those, James Gamble Rogers, because he was encouraged by the university, according to Vincent Scully and others, to sort of wall those off, and Scully said the result was a collection of little paradises that are all separate from one another. On the Caltech campus, they're essentially all next to each other. They're within walking distance, very easily connected, and these arcades also have the effect of bringing them together. So you don't get a sense as you're walking around that you're moving from one separate residential college or dormitory to another, the way that you do at Yale, where even when they have sort of matching neo-Gothic architecture, they feel very distinct and very walled off from one another and from the city at large as well.
I think we could also add that in recent years, please correct me if I'm wrong, but in terms of use, some of the more recent buildings, say the Cahill and the Resnick, both are designed in part to contain modular spaces that can be used for bringing people together. So they're not assigned specifically to a discipline. Let's say they're a space where interdisciplinarity can happen, right, at the level of use. And so, say unlike in the past where a building might be built for the chemists or for the physicists, now we have these buildings that are built to bring those people together into a location.
But I actually think something is the facade, which, here is the same for, at the beginning, the same for everyone, and what happens inside. Inside will be huge differences. And there you have to make big, does it need to be shielded from the sun? Does it need to be vibration-free? Does it need to go deep? Does it need to go high? There I think will be a lot of decisions made depending on what happens in the building. But somehow, especially at the beginning, outside it seemed all the same, whatever that means. Yeah.
This is also a little bit tangential too, but every time NASA has to do anything with JPL from like a bureaucratic standpoint, there's always like a collective groan that happens because JPL is this interesting, it's a federally funded research center instead of a federally operated one. So all of the hardware that exists at the Jet Propulsion Lab is technically owned by NASA, but everybody works for Caltech. And so it's really given JPL quite a bit more latitude to embrace creative projects also. So if we want to consider JPL as sort of an extension of the Caltech campus in that way too, I think that there are some of these dynamics that are also still at play.
We're going to have to wrap up our session. But I hope that the conversation will continue throughout the day, including at 2 o'clock at Scientists and Artists on Failure. Thank you very much all for joining us today.